When I was a kid, I had a friend whose mom collected dolls, but they weren't like fun dolls. My friend's mom collected those porcelain dolls. You know those dolls where you get those, they were pristine porcelain dolls that you used to store behind glass in a glass case and you could never touch them? You know, these kinds of dolls? This is what they used to look like. I remember there was a whole room full of them, and you weren't allowed to touch them. Like, what is the point of a doll if you're not allowed to touch it, right? You were allowed to look at them, but you weren't allowed to touch them. And they just kind of sat there in the case with their like half smile on their face. They're kind of creepy, really. I mean, they don't ever look too happy, right? They're not like something a child looks at and is like, woohoo, I got a new doll. Like, no, these things are weird, right? You never get them out. You never play with them. They never did anything. They just sat there behind this glass case for looks, I guess. And I don't mean to insult anybody, because I'm sure there's somebody in this room who collects porcelain dolls, and I'm really sorry, but I just don't get it. And I realize there must be a market for such things, because people still buy them. If you go on eBay right now, they saturate the market on eBay. So they're honestly, these are, in all honesty, these are like the worst kind of dolls I could ever imagine. They're just the worst. What kid wants that kind of a doll? You know what kind of dolls I used to like when I was a kid? Maybe kind of still do as an adult? Well, let me show you what kind of dolls I like. There you go. The reason why I had that video as the opening video. These are the kind of dolls I like. What kind of dolls are these? Action figures, right. They're action figures. Kids love action figures. My kids love action figures. And you know why kids love action figures? Because they do stuff. They do stuff, right? You can do stuff with action figures. That's why kids love action figures. No kid in the history of the world has ever asked their parents for a glass porcelain doll that sits behind glass and can never be touched or played with for its entire existence. But every kid, well, I can't say every kid, but most kids, at one point or another, have asked their parents for action figures. Because they can move, they can bend, you can play with them, they fly, they fight, they shoot, they run, they do stuff, right? You can make movies out of action figures. If someone made a doll of you, what kind of doll would you be? Are you a doll that sits behind a glass door and does nothing? Or are you the kind of doll that does stuff? When you think about love, and we were talking about this whole series called Love Does, does your love get turned into action? Or is your love more reflective and do nothing and become more like the porcelain doll with a tepid half smile on your face kind of love? Or is your love more reflective of an action figure? What kind of doll do you suppose God wants you to be? That's the question we're going to be pondering this morning. I'll tell you, when it comes to love, a lot of people get screwed up on this whole love thing. That's what we've been talking about over the past few weeks. Historically speaking, as we said before, it's kind of a review for those who've been here. Historically speaking, the church has become really good at talking about love. We've become really good about talking about God, and we say God is love, and we talk about theology, and we dissect these ancient texts, and we formulate these ancient ideas and truths, and we agree on certain belief systems, and we call that orthodoxy, and we spend all of our time, a lot of churches spend all of their time talking about their orthodoxy and their theology. But when we look at Scripture, and when we consider the life of Jesus, while it's true that Jesus emphasized believing in God's truth with a capital T, Jesus also seemed far more interested in demonstrating God's love with a capital L, through tangible actions, actually doing stuff that ultimately changed the world. Kind of the inspiration for our series is a quote that comes from a famous pastor by the name of Dallas Willard. He once said this: "Our most serious failure today as the church is the inability to provide effective practical guidance as to how to live the life of Jesus." Scripture says God is love. God is love. And Jesus is the embodiment of that love. And if you read through Scripture, both the Old and New Testaments, God doesn't sit on a throne in a distant, far-off cloud, dictating laws and religious rules for his people to follow, and then disengage from his people. No, God demonstrates his love for the world by doing, by action. In short, love does. Love is an action. Love is active. It's powerful. It takes risks. It reaches. It changes things. It does things. Love isn't primarily a concept in your head or just a feeling in your heart. Love is the most powerful force in the world, and it happens through people as it's channeled by God. God made you an action figure of his love. That's some deep theology right there, right? That's going to be published someday, and 100 years from now, people are going to be reading it. We're action figures. No. but in all seriousness, though, God made you an action figure of his love and not a porcelain doll. This series that we are talking about is called Love Does, and it's based on the best-selling book by a guy named Bob Goff. This guy here, I have a picture of him. We've looked at it. Bob Goff, if you haven't read this book, you're going to love this book. You should get a copy. In fact, I mentioned to some of you, and I said it during the announcements, but I know we're notoriously late in this church, so I'll mention it again. We're starting up again the Hills Church Book Club that we had going last year, and our first read is Love Does. It just seemed fitting, right? The whole series is inspired by the series. It's not based on the book. It's not following the book, line by line, of course. It's inspired by it. And so what we want to do is we want to read the book, because I think you'll find it absolutely enthralling. If you've never read it before, I think you will. Kim was reading it, and she said something, she described it as kind of like a chicken soup for the soul, because it's a collection of stories. And Bob Goff has this amazing ability to communicate God's love in the way he's able to channel God's love through him, through just amazing stories of selflessness and sacrifice and what he calls whimsical fancy. He just does stuff that seems like absurd to you and me. But it changes people's lives. And as a result of him telling the stories, it's changing the way we see love in general. So we started this series 2 weeks ago talking about Love Does by discussing how the most powerful way you can communicate your love and the love of God to someone else is just by showing up and being present with them. This is the I'm with you principle that Bob Goff would talk about in his book. We talk about how important it is to have the ministry of presence. Just being present in someone's life can change their life for the better. Just showing up. We are having an epidemic of isolation and loneliness in our current culture and society. Even though we're more connected than we've ever been through things like live streams and social media, but we don't know how to connect with people anymore. We don't even know our own neighbors, let alone the people we work with oftentimes in the next cubicle, or people we sit next to in school. We don't really know them. So this idea of just being with them, physically with them, can change someone's life dramatically. Last week, we continued the series and we talked about how this idea of love does, enables us to embrace our failures. We talked about how we are now free to fail and how much the world craves people who are just honest about their shortcomings, who are just human. And so how often the world looks at the church and they call us hypocrites because we put on this mask of perfection. We try to live this life of morality, and we should pursue Christ-likeness in every opportunity we have, every step we take, and everything we do. But when we pretend like there's nothing going on inside, we pretend like there's no shortcomings and no failures, we end up with this air of hypocrisy about us. And so when we just admit that we're broken and that we're humble about our shortcomings, and we acknowledge who we are as failing human beings, normal, average human beings, saved by God's grace, that communicates Love Does in ways that could be profound. Today, what we're going to do is circle back and talk about when love does. What it's doing is faith expressing itself in audacious ways. What I want to talk about this morning, I want to spend a few minutes talking about this morning, is something called audacious love. Audacious love. Audacious. That's a fun word. It's not a word we use every day. Everybody say audacious with me. Audacious. Not bodacious. Audacious. Got it? Audacious. Audacious is a cool word. It's just fun to say. It's hard to spell sometimes if you aren't used to it. I had to use spell check more than I care to admit. This is free to fail. I'm telling you, I failed at spelling. But audacious, what it means, if you're looking up in the dictionary, it means daring, bold, lavish, extravagant. Audacious love is this over-the-top, undeniable love from one person to someone else, something else, or something to us. I love what the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians chapter 5. He says, what is important is faith expressing itself in love. Your faith is meant to express itself. It's meant to do stuff. It's meant to be in action. It's meant to be a verb. Love does. I want us to walk through a passage of Scripture found in Luke chapter 7. And we're not going to get there just yet, but we're going to kind of unpack this thing together. And I want to use this story in Luke chapter 7. And I think will help us unpack and think about audacious love and what it looks like so you can decide if you're going to be an action figure or a porcelain doll. And what it would look like in your life if you decided to take action. Now, a little background is important here to this story because there's a lot of context that we can easily overlook, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page. The religious group in Jesus' day, the Jews, they had some leaders that we know today, we call them the Pharisees. All right? The Pharisees were very intent on being perfect in their life and their obedience to God. And they, as far as they wanted the world to know, they were really good at it. Right? They followed every law. They crossed every T, dotted every I. They followed all the rules. They kept all the laws and never sinned. This was their idea. This was what they believed it meant to be a faithful follower of God. To be faithful to God meant to follow the rules and always put on this air of perfection. Now there was this man named Simon who was a Pharisee. And he throws a dinner party and he invites this new traveling rabbi named Jesus to come to his dinner party. Jesus is friends with everybody, as we already know. We've talked about Jesus' life a multitude of times. Every Sunday is what we talk about. Jesus is friends with everybody, whether they're the low lives, begging on the street, or people high on the totem pole like Simon the Pharisee. Because in Jewish culture, the Pharisees were almost on top of everything. And so he says, sure. So Jesus is at this dinner party. He's at this dinner party, and he's reclining at the table, as the story will tell us, as the context is appropriate. He's reclining at the table when an uninvited and quite unwelcome guest shows up. Now you can picture now all these pastor types, right? They're in their vestments and their robes. They're all sitting around at the dinner table. They're probably debating theology, splitting hairs of ancient Jewish scriptures, and talking about how perfectly they're able to keep the law. And then this happens, starting in verse 37 of Luke chapter 7. When a certain immoral woman from the city heard he was eating, and that's Jesus, heard Jesus was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. We need to stop there for a second, because we need to make sure we know who this woman is. This woman walks in the room, and instantly everybody knows who she is. There's children in the room, so I'm going to use G-rated language. She's the local companion, right? That's what Scripture is describing here when they talk about an immoral woman. She's the local woman who has something for sale that isn't in a case or a box. Let's just put it that way, right? And she's likely dressed in some kind of scandalously revealing clothing. Tight skirt, a top that scoops way too low, lavish makeup, you get the picture, right? Earrings that are way too big for her ears, hair that's probably like way out here. And as she walks in the room, I just imagine in my mind this table full of very conservative, very religious type of people, right? They just gasp. They're like, oh boy, here she comes. She comes trotting into the room, full of uber religious conservative types who wouldn't dare be seen even on the same side of the street as this woman, let alone in the same room. And here she is at Simon's house, while Simon is throwing this kind of high-class dinner party. And if the stories of Mark and John are the same woman in the same event, then the perfume in the jar is worth the equivalent of about a year's salary. So she comes in with her super expensive perfume, this sinful working girl, but she isn't there to work the room. She's there on a different mission, as kind of a humble and broken, eager woman. Picking up in verse 38, this is how Luke carries on with the story. Luke says, then she knelt down behind Jesus. This is talking about him being Jesus at his feet, and she's weeping. Her tears fell at Jesus' feet, and she wipes them with her hair. And then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. What I envisioned at this moment, I'll admit, feels a bit awkward for me. I'm guessing if you were in the same situation, it'd be awkward for you too. This woman, this working girl, is coming into this room of super conservative religious leaders, and now she's bawling and sobbing, and people are staring at her, at the tears, at the weeping, at the scene she's creating. And she starts kissing Jesus' feet. And I'm sure it bothered everyone in the room. But Jesus doesn't seem to mind at all. But after I get past thinking, well, this is awkward, right? Because this is like not where I'd want to be. This is a very awkward situation. Then you can begin to see, you know what this is? This is audacious love. This is audacious love. This is lavish. It's bold. It's extravagant. It's audacious love because on the one hand, she doesn't care what anybody thinks in that room. She doesn't have a care in the world about what they think. What are they going to do, right? Are they going to ruin her reputation? Right? And it's expensive. It's an expensive visit. Her earnings, if you will, she has likely invested in this perfume to make herself more alluring to the men that she serves. And now she's taking this, probably what adds up to her life savings in this alabaster jar. She's taking this perfume that it's kind of like an investment in her business, and she's pouring it out on Jesus' feet. Pouring it out, sacrificing it to this other man who's unlike any other man she's ever known. She's humbled. She's broken. And she puts herself out there offering all with eyes to see her, a demonstration of audacious love. So why does this woman have this kind of audacious love for Jesus? The Bible tells us she's a sinner. Come to find out, I guess when you think about it, everyone in that room was a sinner. It's just that it seems, at least in this circumstance, she's the only person in the room who recognizes that fact. She's the only one who knows her humble estate. And that's what brings her to the point of audacious love for Jesus, because this woman who has received all this money for selling herself now feels worthless, like she's not worth a dime. And she comes to this Jesus and she finds the grace and forgiveness in him that every one of us we all desperately want. Now the Pharisees, they're like disgusted with this, right? They're totally turned off. They're like, oh my goodness. They're thinking, how can this guy say he's from God while he lets an unclean, sinful woman like this touch him like that? And here's the part that, might actually creep you out. Jesus actually knows what they're thinking without them having to say it. He knows what we're thinking without us even having to say it. And he knows the Pharisees what they're thinking. So he says, may I say something? He kind of, interrupts the situation. He breaks the awkwardness of the situation. May I say something? They're like, sure. And Jesus goes on to do what Jesus so often does in these situations. He tells a story, which is so Jesus. And he tells a story of a man who loaned money to two different people. To one guy, he loaned 500 pieces of silver. To the other guy, 50 pieces of silver. The equivalent of about a year and a half salary to one and the equivalent of a couple months' salary to the other guy. In both cases, in either case, it's a lot of money, but they're different amounts. We recognize that. And then Jesus continues in verse 42. He says, and neither of these guys who were deeply in debt could repay the man who lent them the silver. So he kindly forgave them both, canceling their debt. So Jesus says to Simon, who do you suppose loved him more after that? And Simon says, I know, pick me. In verse 43, I suppose the one whom canceled the larger debt. To which Jesus responds, that's right. And Simon's like, oh good, I love to be right. Not realizing The noose is now around his neck. Continuing on in verse 44, then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, look at this woman kneeling here. Look at this woman kneeling here. And trust me, Simon's already noticed, right? Everybody in the room has noticed. Nobody's missing the fact that this woman is kneeling here before Jesus' feet. But now Jesus says, I'm going to draw a comparison. A comparison between this woman and Simon. But he's also going to draw a comparison between this woman and Simon and you and me. Jesus says to Simon, when I showed up at your house for this party, you didn't pay any attention to me at all. Like I was no big deal at all. You didn't wash my feet, which was, by the way, a customary sign of hospitality back in that day. It might be creepy for us here now, but back in the day, in Jesus' time, this was something you did when someone of importance walks into your house. You washed their feet because you walked around in a sandy desert area and you didn't have shoes like we have now. You know, your feet are just filthy. And so it was customary to wash each other's feet. This woman, though, she hasn't stopped washing my feet with her tears since the moment she got here. Simon, when I came into the house, you didn't greet me at the door with a kiss, which was, again, a customary greeting of that day. Today, we might not kiss everybody who walks into our house. That might be a little over the top for us. That's fine. But, you know, we would at least welcome our guests at the door, take their coat, shake their hand, welcome them into our house, maybe show them where the restroom is, maybe offer them something to drink. Like, that's our usual customary greeting. Jesus says, Simon, you didn't do any of that. But this woman has been kissing my feet non-stop. Simon, you didn't go into the kitchen and grab olive oil and say, oh, welcome, and anoint me with oil like is customary when you have an honored guest. But this woman, she didn't use household oil. She's been anointing my feet with this expensive perfume, which she has spent her life savings on. Here you are criticizing this woman, but Simon, there's a big difference between the two of you and how I'm being treated here. Verse 37, Jesus says to Simon, I tell you her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown me much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only a little love. This right here is the key to understanding audacious love. This woman is forgiven much, so she loves much. She's been loved deeply, so she loves deeply. She is a public sinner, but Jesus loved her anyway. She's immoral, but Jesus says, I can forgive that. His love was audacious for her. So it now comes out of her in return. Do you see how that works? Show me someone who loves audaciously, and I'll show you someone who has been loved audaciously every time. So for Simon, the same forgiveness and grace and beautiful love of Jesus was available, but he just didn't think he needed it. So no wonder he doesn't love audaciously like this woman. He didn't feel like he needed or received that kind of love. Friends, being free to love audaciously, to actively put your faith in action, to go and do stuff, it only happens when you realize you yourself have been audaciously loved. Being set free to love audaciously only happens when you realize that you yourself have been audaciously loved. If you want to have God's love flowing through you first, if you want to have God's love flowing through you, first, it's got to happen to you. Us pastors, we love those little rhyming things, right? If you want to have God's love flowing through you, first it's got to happen to you. Let's imagine for a moment. Go with me on this. Let's put ourselves in Jesus' shoes here, all right? Well, let's actually put ourselves in this woman's shoes. Let's say, for instance, you're enjoying your first free Saturday you've had in a long time. Some of us don't get very many free Saturdays, right? A lot of times there's a lot of things to do, work responsibilities, family responsibilities, whatever the case may be. For whatever reason, right now, you're enjoying your first free Saturday you've had in a long time, and you're so excited. You're free to take care of personal errands that have been piling up for weeks. One thing kind of leads to another, and instead of knocking things off the honey-do list, Let's say you're over at Best Buy, browsing at all the new laptops and cameras and, well, my personal favorite, drones. You have to be careful with drones. You might bring another one home. That's just my personal experience. Be careful with the drones. While you're at Best Buy, you're looking at the drones and the cameras and the laptops and all the different gizmos. You run into some old friends and you get to talking about those drones, all the flying you've been doing recently, all the great pictures you've been capturing from like 300 feet in the air. You're having a good time. You're just talking. And I know this is a stretch for some of you, but again, just stay with me, okay? Before long, you find yourself down the road at Kohl's, just enjoying the exceedingly rare opportunity you have to find a new pair of jeans and maybe a couple new shirts. And you're browsing, and of course, you remember, you can't buy anything. Your wife's taught you this. You can't buy anything without trying it on first. So you're taking all those new items back to the dressing room just so you can try on all the best new plaid shirts that you can find, right? Because that's what you do when you're at Kohl's. You look at find all the best new plaid shirts. Next, you realize you haven't picked up a new book in quite some time, and the church is starting the book club again, so you want to go find that weird book Love Does, and maybe there's other things you want to read. So you're down the road again at half-price books, browsing the always thrilling theology and history sections, looking for the next great page-turner, because that's where you find me. And it's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day. So you're outside, driving between stores and running all these errands, having a great time with the windows down, the sunroof open, jamming to your favorite hits from the 90s because all the best music came out of the 90s. And it's almost, it's almost a perfect Saturday, right? You're still with me. You're still with me, right? You can kind of put yourself in these shoes, right? Thank you. I'm not crazy then. But there's one thing missing. You're enjoying this wonderful Saturday, and you realize there's one thing missing. That's your wife. Your spouse. Just as you're starting to think about how much you wish your wife was with you, while you're out gallivanting around enjoying this beautiful Saturday without any responsibilities weighing you down, it hits you. It hits you like a ton of bricks. You remember you were supposed to pick up your wife and the kids from the school that your wife teaches at more than 2 hours ago. But you only have one car today because her car's in the shop, and so you're out driving around in your car, and normally she has her car, but you're down to one car, and your only responsibility of that day is to be back at the school and pick her up at noon. You look at your clock, your watch, and it says 2:15. Then you get that sick feeling in your stomach when you remember this was the night your entire family's coming over to the house for the special family dinner. And your wife wanted to have the house cleaned and the dinner prepared well in advance. You instinctively pull out your phone only to find it's been dead for hours because you forgot to charge it the night before. And you know for certain there's at least a dozen calls waiting for you. There's probably 100 text messages clogging your inbox. And you commit to never charging that phone again because you're never seeing those messages. You're never reading those messages. In a panic, you jump in your car, you run over to the school, and you walk in, and you find the other teachers, your wife's co-workers, are still there, chatting and laughing amongst themselves, having a good time until they see you walk in. When you walk in the room goes silent. You can hear a pin drop. You ask, is my wife here? And they look at you with this, like, I'm looking at a dead man look that only women know how to make their face, and contort their face into. And they say, she was. Her father came and picked her and the kids up a couple hours ago. You borrow a phone and you call home, only your wife doesn't answer the phone. Her father answers the phone and says, son, I don't know where you are right now, but I'm telling you, man to man, this is mano a mano. I'm telling you, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, your best bet is to stay away for the next 6 months. I'm here, the kids are fine, everyone's fine, your wife is fine. I volunteered to play with the kids while she gets everything ready. And in a whispered voice he adds, I think I'm also here to make sure she doesn't grab a gun and murder us all. Stay away. I gotta go. For your own safety, stay away. It's like, he hangs up and you just know it. You're a dead man. The 15 years of marriage, gone. The divorce papers have been written up. Your beautiful home and the loving kids, gone. So you're coming up with excuses. You're driving home, you're trying to get there white knuckle all the way. You got to come up with something, right? You got to come up with some logical explanation of what happened. You're going through all these scenarios in your mind. Honey, there were terrorists in the mall, and they wouldn't let any of us go until 2 o'clock. No, that won't work. That won't work. There was a lady There was a lady, an older lady, she was crossing the street. It was really busy, I had to help her across the street. And then she asked me if I'd take her home, and she lived in Erie. So I drove to Erie. But you know you're not going to use any of that. You know you're going to get there, and you're going to say the only thing you can say, the only thing every husband knows how to say better than anything else in the world, which is, honey, I'm sorry. I'm an idiot. I forgot. There's no excuse. I'm sorry. You pull up to the house. You jump out of the car. You start heading for the door. Before you can even reach for the door handle, the door swings open, and there's your wife standing in the entryway. She's got a knife in one hand, a spoon in the other, and she's got this gnarly look on her face. She's got this look on her face that could kill the devil himself. And you walk in to the house like a dog with his tail between his legs as she growls, "Where were you? You told me, you promised me you'd be there at noon." You slowly lift your eyes to meet her, and you muster the most apologetic, penitential tone you can imagine and say, "Honey, I'm sorry. I forgot. There's no excuse. I'm an idiot. I just forgot." You quickly check to see if that's working. She lets a pregnant pause stand for a moment before responding with a, "All right. I forgive you. I'm just glad you're okay. I've been worried sick. I love you. And when I couldn't get a hold of you, I found myself more scared than upset. Give me a kiss. Let's forget about it." She does. She says that. Go with me here, right? Just stay with me on this, all right? This is a story, okay? She says, "I forgive you. Give me a kiss. Let's forget about it." Now, I have a question for all the husbands in the room. What kind of kiss are you giving your wife in this moment? Huh? Are you giving her a little "nice to see you" peck on the cheek? A little "it's been a while, glad we can catch up" sort of courtesy kiss? Of course not. You're going for the biggest, sloppiest, most audacious kiss you've ever mustered in your entire life. You're not just stopping with a kiss. You're going in. You're leaning her back. You're doing like they do in the movies. You're laying a thick one on her. Then you're going over to the stereo and you're putting on smooth jazz music. And you're dancing around the house, through the dining room and the living room. You don't care if the kids see you. You don't care if your father-in-law's in the house. You're Mr. Romance all of a sudden, right? You're laying it on thick. And once all of that's done, once you've completely and totally communicated your love and admiration and thanksgiving for your wife's love, grace, and mercy with hugs and kisses and dancing, you're begging her. You're desperate to know, how can you help her? How can you make this right? How can you get right to work and do every chore she asks you? Not once, not twice, but 3 times you're going to do them all. You're going to vacuum those floors. You're going to scrub the walls. You're going to clean the bathroom. You're going to wash every dish. You're going to take the dishes off the rack that are already clean. You're washing them again. You're doing it all. You're getting the house perfect for the upcoming dinner with her family. You do everything you can. 3 times, just for good measure. So the question I have for you now, how much does that remind you of your relationship with God? How much does that picture that I just described for you describe your worship of God? How much does that sound like the way you feel in the presence of God, who has loved you audaciously? Sometimes it's fascinating, isn't it? We come in here and we sing songs, and I guess it's worship. You know, we just come in and we do what we're supposed to do. Peck on the cheek, we sing a few songs, we get to go through the motions. There you go, God. Are you happy, God? Is that enough? Is that okay? You know, is that all right? Okay, good. I'll continue on with my week. I have more important things to do. Someone asked me, someone asked me to spend my precious time doing the Lord's work. Okay, God, I did a little thing. I volunteered at His place. I volunteered here and there. I did a couple of things. Is that enough? Is that okay? Are you happy with me, God? Okay, someone now wants me to, give some of my precious money for the kingdom of God. Okay, here's a buck. Okay, God, here's a quick buck. Here's a kiss on the cheek. Is that enough for you? Are you happy, God? Are you satisfied? Is that pleasing to you? I mean, doesn't that sound crazy? Doesn't that sound crazy? Because when you've been loved audaciously, you love audaciously in return. You can't help yourself. You can't help yourself. You're so overwhelmed with joy and thanksgiving that you're overflowing with this love and joy. It just pours out of you. 1 John chapter 3. says this exactly. This is exactly what happens to us all. The Apostle John writes this in 1 John chapter 3. He says, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. It's audacious action for us. So we ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. Audacious love in return. When someone loves you audaciously, the only appropriate response is to love audaciously in return. That's what the woman was doing when she knelt before Jesus' feet. That's what Simon couldn't do. It turns out, if you experience the audacious love God has for you, you'll find yourself incapable of holding back your audacious love for other people. If you experience what God has done for you as a result of his love for you, you'll find yourself incapable of holding back doing stuff for others as a result of your love for them. In short, love does. Romans 5, Paul writes this in Romans chapter 5. He says, when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Now, most people would be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who's especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. He paid your debt and your sin in an audacious way. Imagine that. You've got to let that love come to you, and then you won't be able to help yourself from loving others audaciously in response. My question for you then is this. Do you know that you've been loved like that? Do you know that you've been loved like that? Being set free to love audaciously only happens when you realize that you yourself have been audaciously loved. Do you know you have been? And if you don't know that yet, my prayer is that today is the day you say, yes, I do, I recognize it now. To say yes to the audacious love God has for you through the sacrifice and the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you've never said yes to God, friends, we are the immoral woman who has been forgiven by Jesus. We are the ones at Jesus' feet, grateful and alive. If you've never acknowledged that, if you've never intentionally taken the step to become a Christ follower, today very well could be your day. Let's talk, Let's have some baptisms. Let's get people taking a dunk for Jesus as a way of saying thank you in one of the most audacious and sacred ways possible. Do you know you're loved audaciously? Here's another question for you. Are you ready to love audaciously? Are you ready to be an action figure instead of a porcelain doll behind a glass case? Get out from behind the glass case. If you know you've been loved, if you know God's loved you audaciously, get out from behind the glass case and go do stuff. I know I've been loved, and I'm eager to do more. I can't help myself but wanting to do more. So I'm eager to get us all as a church to just do more stuff. Let's bless some people. Don't wait for me or Kevin or someone else to come up with a genius idea. You have the genius idea, and let's go bless some people together. Let's do stuff. I don't know what. Let's just get busy. I want to love audaciously because I know I've been loved audaciously. I hope you'll join me. Let's close with a word of prayer.